Good evening, and welcome to Institute of Politics. Thank you for coming in this fine spring weather. Before we begin the actual discussion itself, I would just like to thank all of our renowned panelists for coming this evening and offering their ideas and insights on the issue of government censorship with us. And as moderator of our discussion this evening, a gentleman who on very short notice kindly agreed to run this evening's events, and aside from being former associate law dean of the law school, has excelled in issues as far as being moderator of nationally televised political debates and writing poker computer programs. I'd like to introduce to you Professor Charles Neston of the Harvard Law School. Thank you very much.
Good evening. I gather that our subject tonight is Big Brother watching? And at least it's my assumption that, yes, Big Brother is watching, and let's go home. The question seems rather to me to be, should Big Brother be watching? Who should Big Brother be watching? What should he be watching? What are Big Brother's methods for watching? And is Big Brother doing something more than watching? Now, I have to confess that I come to this subject not as a completely neutral moderator, but with some bias. My own introduction to the subject came in early 1970s in a case called United States versus Daniel Ellsberg, a case that my friend Morton Halperin was also involved in ways which may become clearer as the evening goes on. Daniel Ellsberg, you remember, came to notoriety by releasing the Pentagon Papers, History of the Vietnam War, to the New York Times. The government, Mr. Nixon, Mr. Mitchell, then tried to enjoin the New York Times, and that gave rise to one set of litigation. But the government then also came after Ellsberg with a criminal indictment and charged him specifically with espionage and with theft. And since one of the subjects that I think is of some interest tonight, and indeed part of the design, is to lay out to you methods by which Big Brother might attempt to control the dissemination of secrets, I thought it might be worthwhile as a just brief introduction to describe to you the problem that the government faced in that Ellsberg case. You're all familiar with the concept of classification. It's the nice stamp that goes on a document that says top secret or something else. What the government would have liked back at the time of the Ellsberg case was to be able to prosecute someone as a criminal for disclosing a classified document. And that would be it. The elements of the case would be proof that someone had taken a properly classified document and disclosed it, bang, criminal, put him away. Unfortunately for the government, there's no statute that generally accomplishes that. There is some law with respect to some very narrow categories of secrets. But by and large, that's not the law in the United States. And so they had to dig for a prosecution. And the two major components were, one, espionage, two, straightforward theft. Each had a problem. The idea with espionage is that someone has dealt with information in a way that injures the national defense. Now, typically that information is classified information, but the mere fact of it being classified is not enough to make release of the information espionage. You have to substantively demonstrate to a jury that the information that was released was in fact damaging. And that means two things. One, it means the information itself has to become public, and that has given rise to a whole set of kind of gray mail defenses for defendants who want to resist prosecution. Second, they have to demonstrate that its release really was injurious to the national defense. And that turns out to be not always so easy for the kinds of information that the government would sometimes like to keep secret, but has difficulty doing. The second element of the Ellsberg case was theft of property, just as if you had stolen a tank from the United States government, physical stuff. And there is a crime that makes it a felony to steal government property worth more than $100. Now, if you think about it for a moment, you'll see, well, there's a problem there too, because what is the property that we're talking about? We know we're talking about secrets, but what is the property? And most of the kind of property that we talk about when we think theft is physical in nature. It's of a kind that can be possessed by one person, and that possession divested when somebody else takes it, and so another person has it. The thing that's unique about information as a property concept is that it can be possessed by lots of people at once. And so you hit the question, what is it? What was stolen? And in fact, the government hit it in the most interesting way. They had to prove that property was taken that was worth more than $100. And you know, they had trouble proving the more than $100. If you think about it for a minute, what witness do they put on the stand? What does the witness testify to that says that what Ellsberg stole was worth more than $100? Yes, it cost a lot of money to do the project that generated the Pentagon Papers. But do you allocate that down to the particular volume that Ellsberg released? Is any book worth the total cost of what went into it? Do you measure it by the market value? Well, the information was still there after he'd released it to the New York Times. It turns out that the concept of secrecy is itself a very elusive kind of concept to deal with legally. And in a sense, that frames our subject tonight. That is, in a sense, what we will be talking about, I believe primarily, will be methods by which the government goes about trying to control this very elusive notion, secrecy. That is, control the release of information, particular kinds of information by particular people under particular circumstances. And it turns out it's not a straightforward and easy thing to do. On the other hand, it turns out the government has considerable resource and imagination in coming up with new ways to do it. And for some of those, I am prepared now to turn to our panel. First, I'd like to introduce to you someone who truly in this audience needs no introduction, Sissela Bach. Sissela Bach is a lecturer on ethics at Harvard. She is the author of 2 books, one Secrets, the other Lying. She is an authority on this subject, quite obviously, and has testified before the Congressional Subcommittee on Civil Liberties Restrictions. I give you Sissela Bach.
Thank you very much. I'd like to pick up on what Professor Neston was saying about secrecy, because I think he is right that there is a tension over what secrecy might be for the government in any one country and for the citizens of that government. Now, in the United States, this tension has existed since the beginning of this nation. People have sometimes had very extreme views. For instance, Woodrow Wilson, when he was running for president in 1912, denounced all secrecy, maintained that all of government had to be carried on out in the open. And he said, secrecy means impropriety. Now, I think we know perhaps what he means by that, and I think we understand the dangers of secrecy that he meant to talk about. But we also have to be very clear about the fact that secrecy does not necessarily mean impropriety at all. Secrecy can be indispensable for governments as it can for individuals. It can be indispensable in protecting the liberty of a nation or of individuals who work for the government. Employee records, for instance, must obviously be at times kept as secret as people want them to be. Police records as well, it's important that they should not be out in the open all the time. And Woodrow Wilson, who made this statement in 1912, changed his mind very quickly, immediately upon becoming president. And he, I think, realized that some secrecy was indeed indispensable, not only domestically, but also internationally and in negotiations. So that we have to say then that governments need secrecy. The trouble is that governments also, on the whole, abuse secrecy. They get too much of it, and secrecy tends to spread. Once they have a little, they can introduce a little more, and they can often do so in secret. And government secrecy, therefore, carries immense dangers, dangers that are much greater, on the whole, than the secrets that individuals might have. The dangers of government secrecy are to the democracy itself. The more secrecy there is, on the whole, the less democracy. The more the government has the power to control information, the less citizens can do to learn about what it is that government might be planning, invasions of other countries, for instance. The danger of government secrecy is not only to democracy, but very much also to individual liberties, to the liberties of the people that this new government power might affect. Individuals who work for the government, for instance, if they are being censored, individuals who are being probed by the government, if that is happening. And finally, I believe that government secrecy is also immensely dangerous to national security. It is dangerous to national security because it cuts down on the kind of feedback and the kind of criticism that a government needs in order to conduct international affairs. And in all of these areas, with respect to democracy, to individual liberties, and to national security, secrecy in government affects these areas because it tends to grow, because it damages choice very badly, and because it can so easily be abused. But when people talk about secrecy this year, they very often use the Orwellian analogy. We are in the year 1984, and people very often ask about Big Brother and talk about Big Brother and talk about 1984. And I guess I would like to say here to begin with that I think that analogy is a poor one. We are not living in Orwell's Oceania. We are not living in anything comparable at all to 1984. And I think it's important to say that because it's so easy to reach for an extreme analogy and to fool ourselves into thinking that the problems that we have are very similar. I don't believe they are. Nevertheless, if the 1984 analogy is a poor one, it is nevertheless perhaps useful for us in the year 1984 to ask ourselves, how is our democracy holding up against government manipulation, against the growth of government secrecy, and against the growth of government censorship? And here I would say that I think there are reasons for alarm, but there are also reasons for what one might call modest cheer. And in the few minutes that I have, I'll just talk about a little about each of those. In the first place, there is reason for great alarm, I believe, with respect to government secrecy and government censorship in this country. We have seen an unprecedented build-up in peacetime. There has never been such a build-up of secrecy and censorship in this nation in peacetime before, and we have indeed even seen measures recently that never even existed in wartime in this country. We have seen press censorship instituted with respect to the invasion of Grenada, for instance, that has never existed before. We see censorship over scientific research spreading not only from areas that are now classified, but also to areas that are not classified. And we see a number of scientists now beginning to think that they might not want to go into certain fields if those fields are threatened with censorship. And of course, this is one way in which censorship is so damaging to national security. There was a story recently in the Boston Globe which indicated that somebody had gone around asking the various scientists who worked on the Manhattan Project in the Second World War whether they would still have signed up for that project if they had known or if they had been asked to sign a censorship agreement, a pre-publication agreement forcing them to submit their writings from then on for lifetime to government censors. And apparently to a man, and there were only men, to a man they all said that they would not have worked for the government. They would not have worked on the Manhattan Project under those conditions. Well, right now there are a number of scientists who are beginning to wonder not only about whether or not to work for the government, but about whether or not to change fields altogether in order to avoid the possibility of censorship. So that we have the press, we have science, there are restrictions on travel that we have not had before, travel into the United States by a number of individuals for political reasons. We have censorship that has been planned and has not really succeeded yet with respect to government officials. And that is the famous, by now, presidential directive numbered 84 as it happened, that was put into effect last March 11th, 1983. And this directive, as you may know, it would have involved censorship over the writings of government officials who had been in contact with very sensitive classified information for the rest of their life with respect to not only classified materials that they might somehow wish to publish, but also unclassified materials that, quote unquote, relate to classified materials. That means anything that could have to do, for instance, with undercover activities in Central America right now, has to do with the kind of newspaper articles we're reading right now about the mining of ports in Nicaragua, etc. That same directive also authorized government agencies to subject employees to polygraph tests, so-called lie detector tests, if they were suspected of leaking. Well, there have been a great many other measures as well. There have been efforts to change the Freedom of Information Act. There have been efforts also to impede its functioning, even though it wasn't possible for the government to change the act itself. There are a number of those measures, and I think it's important to see that they are moving along together and they are being pushed ahead together. It is what you might call a secrecy offensive, almost a secrecy race, in fact, comparable to the arms race. And it is to some extent understandable why this government and why other governments should feel especially nervous about secrecy and about national security at this time. The Soviet Union, as we very well know, exercises immense secrecy and almost complete censorship over its citizens, so that it's tempting then for a country that finds itself in an adversarial position with respect to the Soviet Union to want to approximate, to want to imitate some of those secrecy measures, especially in a time like this one where the tensions, the international tensions, have risen so greatly that, again, there is perhaps no comparison in peacetime to the kind of tensions we now have between East and West. At a time like that, it's very natural that a government should reach out for more secrecy, more censorship, in the feeling that perhaps this might increase national security. And the more so for a third reason, and that is the new technology that permits the invasion and the intrusion into all kinds of secrets that could earlier have been kept relatively safe. So that paradoxically, it is now getting harder and harder for governments to keep a number of military secrets. And at the same time, we have more and more secrecy. We have secrets then that can't be kept as long as in the past, and we have much more secrecy and many more efforts at secrecy to compensate for that. So that there is reason for alarm then. There is reason, given the dangers that secrecy and censorship provide for our nation and for any nation, to see this advance, this secrecy offensive that one might, as I said, almost call a secrecy race. But there is also reason for modest cheer, as I suggested, because I believe that the United States is not very good at pursuing that kind of race. The citizens in America are not so easy to put down, in a sense. The most extreme secrecy measures and censorship measures have encountered extraordinary resistance in this country, and especially that Presidential Directive 84, providing for lifetime censorship of former public officials and polygraph testing. At first, it was arrived at in entire secrecy, and in fact, the way in which that directive was put together is a very good example of why secrecy so often prevents good judgment, why it impairs with choice of the very best kind. That directive was arrived at in secret. There was no feedback particularly. There was no public criticism. There was no chance for Congress to debate it. and certainly there was no chance for the courts to have a say. And so that there was then no consultation at all. It was put in, as I said, on March 11, and it had a name that, or part of it at least had a name that Orwell would have liked very much. Instead of censorship, it said pre-publication review. Now, this is the kind of language that Orwell loved to analyze when he talked about newspeak. For a while, there wasn't very much reaction, in part because of that word itself. There was little protest. But then, over the summer, people began to think, can this really be true? Can it be that in the United States of America, we are now going to have lifetime censorship of public officials, of former public officials even? And people began to wonder about that. Former officials themselves began to speak up. Associations of newspaper publishers and editors began to speak up. Journalists began to have their say. Senators, congressmen, many others spoke out. And in the end, it was necessary for the administration to suspend this measure. It has not been done away with, but it has been suspended for now. And I think that it's interesting to see that in a democracy such as this one, there are ways of combating measures that are so inimical to the democracy itself and to individual liberties. It worked in this case, and I think that that should give courage to the people who are now struggling, the scientists, the journalists, others who are struggling against censorship in science, against press censorship, should give them courage also to struggle on and to realize that these changes don't come about in one day necessarily, or 1 week, or in 1 month. But if people keep on debating them in areas and in places such as this one, and in the press, and in the Congress, and in the courts, then it is very hard to turn a democracy around so radically as has been attempted. But I would also say that we shouldn't rest on this one laurel. It is important that there has been a change with respect to this most dangerous kind of censorship, but we shouldn't rest on that laurel. We must be very careful so that the measure is not reintroduced, and we have to consider how we might better cope with questions of security than through censorship. Because for all Americans, I think that the traditions of free speech and of a free and informed press and of freedom of research have combined, those traditions have come together to be as a beacon to many people abroad who do suffer from censorship, who do suffer from government control over information, and who do suffer under secrecy. And this year, 1984, is a crucial year, I believe, for the preservation of this heritage in our country and for a great many other nations. Thank you very much.
James Bamford is a writer and a lawyer. He started his career as an investigator, investigating white-collar crime. He then moved to writing a book about the National Security Agency, which is the most secret of all of the government agencies, the major agency for government listening, communications intelligence. The resulting book is The Puzzle Palace, a report on NSA, America's most secret intelligence agency. This was the first full book-length treatment of the NSA. Despite efforts by the federal government to block the release of portions of the book, The Puzzle Palace was published by Houghton Mifflin in 1982 and became a national bestseller. Last year, The Puzzle Palace was voted the best investigative book of 1982 by investigative reporters and editors and the National Association of Investigative Reporters. Mr. Bamford has also written for the Washington Post, the New York Times Book Review, The Nation, and other publications. He's currently at work on another book, and the government is undoubtedly at work on him. Mr. Bamford.
These are not my remarks, so don't worry about that. It's a manuscript that I just finished reading. It's called The Negative Asset. And 2 weeks ago, the government in Britain issued an injunction against the author and seized every copy of this manuscript in England. And I think having a copy here kind of shows what good that does. If the government seizes a lot of information and puts it in a vault, yet all that information isn't collected, it doesn't really do much good. And I think that's been the history of government secrecy to a great degree in the past. What I'd like to speak about is an issue that doesn't get a lot of press attention, but it's an issue that I've had to deal with quite a bit. It's called reclassification. It's when something is not classified, just like this manuscript is not classified here in the United States. But all of a sudden, the government changes its mind and decides that it should be classified. And the author or the writer is at jeopardy at that point. I'd like to bring it down to more or less specific topics. I'm not going to talk on the theoretical aspect of it. I think there's a lot of people here that can speak on the theoretical aspects, but I'd like to speak on the practical aspects of that policy and secrecy in general. When I did my book, The Puzzle Palace, I had never worked for NSA or been involved in any information that I wrote about in my book. I was just a writer, a journalist, basically writing on this topic. I started my research in 1979, and one of the first things I did was I submitted a Freedom of Information Act request to the Justice Department for a document that had to do with illegal activities on the part of NSA. It was a task force report on possible criminal activity engaged in by NSA in the field of electronic eavesdropping, domestic electronic eavesdropping. When I requested the material, it took 10 months for the Justice Department to finally review it, declassify it, and release it to me. It was originally classified top secret Umbra. Umbra is a code name that puts it above top secret. You can have a whole lecture just on code words, I think. When I received the manuscript, or rather when I received the document 10 months later, there were portions deleted. I didn't really think much of it. It was just one document among many I was using for the book. Again, this was around 1979, and it was released by the Carter administration at that time. 2 years later, however, it was the Reagan administration. The Reagan administration had come into office, so it was in the final stages of my manuscript. And all of a sudden, the Justice Department decided to reclassify the document. They decided to reclassify it as top secret. So they had a lawyer get in touch with me from the Justice Department, and we had a meeting in Washington. I was represented by Mark Lynch, who's an outstanding civil liberties union lawyer. We discussed the issue, and they said that they felt that the Carter administration had made a mistake in releasing the document to me, and they wanted the document back. And I said, well, that's really unfortunate, since I've already used it in my manuscript, and it wasn't classified at the time I received it. Well, that didn't really satisfy him, so we had another meeting up in Boston in my publisher, Hope Mifflin's office. The attorney from the Justice Department came up, and two attorneys from the, or not attorneys, but two officials from NSA came up. And this time, again, I rejected the idea of giving the document back to the government. But this time they really weren't that satisfied with it, and they brought up the idea of using the Espionage Statute against me. There is a little piece of the Espionage Statute that says if you come into possession of a document accidentally or inadvertently somehow, you have an obligation of giving that document back to the government. The problem was I came into possession of an unclassified document that they're turning around and reclassifying as top secret. Well, we just continued to argue in letters to the Justice Department that the executive order on secrecy says once a document has been declassified, it can't be reclassified. It's very clear language, and it's not very ambiguous. So what President Reagan did was change the executive order to say once a document's been declassified, it can be reclassified, and that's currently in existence now. They didn't try to use that on my case because it would have been more or less ex post facto. It would have been after the fact in my case. But when the book came out, we ran into another problem, and that's I used a library in Virginia, a library called the George C. Marshall Research Library, which contains all the papers of George C. Marshall, in addition to papers of a few other people. and those few other people are William F. Friedman and at the time, Marshall Carter. William Friedman was one of the founders of NSA. Marshall Carter is a former director of NSA. I made extensive use of papers in the Carter collection and the Friedman collection. These were mostly personal papers, letters between Friedman and other people after he left office, after he left the NSA. And none of them were dated earlier than around 1960. Well, the NSA didn't like the fact that I was using these materials, and not before the book came out, but after the book came out, and after the material was already quoted in my book and released in every bookstore in the country. They went down to the library and began pulling these very same documents off the shelf and stamping them secret and locking them in a vault, which didn't make an awful lot of sense, since anybody who had a few dollars could go into a bookstore and buy a book that had the same information. Yet they continued to do this. They went down there, stamped the documents secret, locked them in a vault. I think they spent 3 days down there. And they thought they were doing it all in secrecy. What they didn't know was I knew somebody down there, and the person told me what was going on the whole time. And as soon as the NSA left, I called up the New York Times, a friend that I had at the New York Times, and he went down there and asked for the documents in the back of my book and the footnotes, and was told that the NSA had just reclassified them and wrote a story about it. And that generated a lot more interest in it, and the American Civil Liberties Union, the two major historical societies in the country, and the American Library Association have all filed suit now against NSA over this issue. They're kind of using it as the line beyond which you can't go. I mean, you can stamp everything in Washington secret, and there's not really much the average citizen can do about it. But once you start walking into public libraries and pulling things off shelves and stamping them secret and ordering the librarian to keep it locked in a vault, that's the line beyond which rational people, I think, say that the government shouldn't go. The government hasn't really said much about this. I think they're holding their comments for the trial, if it goes to trial, for at least the court hearing. What the NSA did do was a week before the suit was filed, was go down there and they pulled out about, I guess, 3/4 of the material and put them back on the open shelf again. So, but there's still about 1/4 or 1/3 or whatever it is still locked up in the vault down there that they're going to argue over. So you can see that government secrecy can get into a point where you get into total absurdity, where the material has been there now for, my book came out in '82. It's been there for a couple of years, came out in paperback last September. So it's not keeping something secret that is secret. It's keeping something secret for some reason I haven't figured out yet. But I just wanted to give an idea of the practical side of secrecy, not just the theoretical side, and how it affects people. Unlike the order that President Reagan came down with demanding all former government officials to submit their writings to the federal government, the issue of reclassification, I think, affects a lot more people. It affects all of you. It could potentially affect all of you, anybody who might write about government, anybody who might use any kind of a government document to write about government. Because at the time you have the document, at the time you're writing about the issue, it might be all well and good, but the new administration comes into office and they don't like that topic, or they don't like you having that document, and they just say that should be top secret from now on, and it's never been tried in court, but it's a very serious situation to find yourself in. I wouldn't envy anybody who found themselves in that position. I think that's one of the things that should be corrected at some time in the future by a new administration, if not before, getting rid of this reclassification idea. I'll be happy to take questions after the speakers have finished speaking. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Bamford. Our next speaker is Ms. Kathleen Troya. Ms. Troya is the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Public Affairs in the Department of Defense. She was formerly the Assistant to the Secretary of Defense. She has served in the past with the Senate Armed Services Committee professional staff and was responsible for oversight of the defense budget and the defense authorization bill. In an earlier position, Ms. Troyer was a research assistant to Dr. Henry Kissinger and General Brent Snowcroft at the National Security Council. It's a pleasure to welcome you, Ms. Troyer, and thank you for coming as a sort of emissary from the administration. I appreciate it.
I think I'd like to start with telling you why I came here tonight. I didn't come because I'm a martyr. I didn't come because I enjoy standing up on a panel with 4 other people who would paint me, or me by example, as the heart of all evil. I came because I didn't even come because I'm an expert or that I've written a book on this subject. I came because I believe in a democracy, and I believe that it's a very living thing. And I believe in the right to free speech. And I very much believe that it sometimes becomes necessary to go before a group of people who don't want to hear what you might have to say or might very much disagree with it. But that it's very important in a situation like that to stand up, even if it's only allowed to stand up for a minute, and say some things that you believe in. Having said that, I think I'd like to clarify that I am not a spokesman for the entire administration. I think that would be a bit much to ask of anybody. I am a spokesman of the Defense Department, and I'd like to explain to the best that I know what the Defense Department position is on a number of these things. There has been a growing concern in the Department of Defense, probably beginning in the middle 70s, and this is not necessarily by political appointees as much as it's an area of concern for career civil servants, the people who work in government for a lifetime, that there were great problems with securing legitimately classified information and keeping it out of the hands of enemy agents, I mean, basically spying. The concern came for a number of reasons. One, in the middle 70s, there are many ways that you attempt to secure legitimately classified information. One of them is to make sure that intensive background investigations are given to people before they have access to this kind of information. And another way is to secure that once the person has access to this information, he or she does not reveal it. The Defense Department, as probably all sorts of elements of government, are always concerned with unauthorized leaks to the media and to the public in general. But in the Defense Department, we were particularly concerned with information that would get into the hands of the Soviets. I mean, information not so much on what was the latest state of rivalry between the State Department and the Defense Department over Lebanon, for example, but much more concerned with the kinds of information that would let them accelerate their weapons buildup. For example, the kind of information that goes into how do you build a guidance system for a cruise missile. It's what we call compartmented information. How do you go about determining what the Shah, or not the Shah of Iran, but Khomeini is doing in Iran, and what is the Iran-Iraq war? What are the implications of that? Those are the kind of things that we're much more concerned about keeping out of the hands of a potential enemy. The Defense Department in the late 70s, to go back and trace why we were concerned, there were a couple of reasons. One, I'd mentioned personnel security, the kind of background investigations that are done of people before they have access to classified information. In the mid-70s, and basically 1974, the Privacy Act, which I, for one, welcome, had a funny effect on a lot of local and government law enforcement agencies. They were very confused as to what kind of information they could turn over to people who were investigating potential government employees who were going to have access to classified information. There were a number of budget cutbacks on the size of the staffs of people who were going out and investigating these field investigations. The bottom line was that people were applying for government jobs and were applying for security clearances in connection with that, and instead of taking 2 or 3 months to find out whether you were a security risk to your country or not, it was taking more like 18 months. So the ability to investigate someone and their suitability for handling this kind of information, which I have described, was to a certain extent put in jeopardy. The other thing that started happening in the late 70s, middle to late 70s, was a great increase in espionage. I think you probably all read about a number of the cases. I won't bother to go through them here. Particularly espionage, not so much with current full-time government employees as espionage with people who are government consultants, say in the Silicon Valley, who are developing a lot of very advanced technologies. As a result of these things, in the early 80s, the Department of Defense held a series of meetings and appointed a number of career officials, lawyers and career intelligence experts and scientists, to look into, do we have a real problem with keeping our secrets secret from foreign agents? They took about a year to study it, and they basically concluded that, yeah, we do have a problem, but we're not sure how to handle it. Well, we have some ideas. Some of their ideas, and they were just that, ideas, were that we would consider two kinds of ways. Now, again, we're not concerned with leaks in the media. We're far more concerned with espionage. In order to be targeting the most serious parts of where espionage could do you damage, in government there are several kinds, ratchets of security clearances. The first one is secret. The next one is top secret. There's another one on top of that. And then way up on top of here, there are compartments. You do not get cleared for all of the compartments. You get cleared for the compartment that deals with the kind of information you're dealing with. In other words, if you're a research scientist and you're developing, again, a guidance system for weapons, or if you're developing a reconnaissance satellite, you might have this kind of compartment. If you were someone dealing with intelligence reports coming out of Iran, for example, we call that human intelligence, intelligence reported by people, spies, you would have another kind of compartment. There are very few people who have all the compartments. I would say probably the Secretary of Defense, the President, people like that. Most people, myself included, might have no compartments, or they would have just one or two compartments, depending upon what kind of work they were doing. The thought was, in the Defense Department, and this preliminary document I've talked about, the ideas that people came up with, was let's take the people, those few people who are cleared for the compartments, and think about doing two things. One, have them sign what we were thinking of doing, a pre-publication clearance. If you are a person who has compartmented information and you are going to, as a current employee or a former employee, write about that compartment, then you would have to submit that document which you thought might contain classified information about that compartment for review. If you were the same former government official or current government official and you wanted to write about the administration's position on arms control or policy in Central America or policy towards the Middle East, you wouldn't have to submit your document at all, only if you were dealing with the technical aspects of that compartment. In other words, if you wanted to write about the guidance system of a cruise missile, you would have to probably have that pre-cleared. The other thing that was thought of, and again, these have not been adopted, they're just still being debated 4 years later or 3 years later, was the very limited use of counterintelligence polygraphs. In other words, if you are someone who is in, again, these compartments, and you are suspected of, and there is other evidence that people have turned up that you might be somehow connected with espionage, that you would be asked if you would like to take a polygraph, a counter-espionage polygraph. If you refused, then you would be transferred to another part of the Defense Department at an equivalent salary, rank, and authority. That's your old job. The only difference would be you wouldn't be getting this compartmentalized information. If you did submit to a polygraph, the examiner would apprise you of your legal rights, go through the questions with you in advance, and would be allowed to ask you 3 questions, or 3 categories of questions. Are you a foreign agent? Have you ever been a foreign agent? Do you know anyone who is? And have you ever been approached to be one? They could not ask you about your sexual preferences, your personal preferences, your political preferences. They could only ask you about your relationship to espionage. Now, with the Directive 84 that the other people have alluded to, and there was a lot of confusion as to what the Defense Department wanted to do and what the government wanted to do, there was a moratorium placed by Congress on these 2 elements of Directive 84, which other people have discussed, and I gather they've, to my knowledge, they've slightly inaccurately stated them. In fact, in a great way inaccurately stated them, but I won't go into that. The Defense Department caught up in it. People started confusing these two different things, the espionage one and this Directive 84. And so the Defense Department has now put a hold on whatever action it was planning to take in this regard. We have gone back up to the congressional committees trying to explain that our case is quite different. Again, we're concerned with espionage. And are currently working with the intelligence committees in Congress and the House and the Senate Armed Services committees to try to come up with a way. I mean, maybe the way that we've thought of and internally discussed is not the best way to get at the problem. We're certainly willing to listen to other people's arguments. We still remain concerned, however, about the espionage problem. I'm not sure what the fate of this will be. I'm sure it'll probably be discussed for a long time, and I'm sure people will misrepresent it as something that perhaps isn't. In the end, however, we do remain concerned about the espionage situation, and particularly because, for a couple of reasons, and I think it's worth going into why. I mean, it's not just that you don't like spies or you don't like the other guy to know what you're doing. It's because it can end up costing money, I mean, in very real terms. I'm sure some people here tonight would dispute the fact that the Soviet Union has been engaged in a military buildup. I believe they have, and I believe it's particularly upsetting because I think it's been in nuclear weapons and a very particular kind of nuclear weapons. The kind of nuclear weapons that they're building are very dependent upon microelectronics for their guidance systems. The SS-20, for example, the SS-18s. And the Soviet Union has been particularly bad and inept at manufacturing a lot of this high technology themselves. They have engaged, as I was saying earlier, in a fairly widespread espionage effort, largely directed at the Silicon Valley, to get the same kinds of things that they're not able to produce domestically, or if they are, it's over a much greater period of time at a much greater cost to themselves. They attempt to steal it and then use it into their weapon systems. Now, ultimately, this costs the United States money. I mean, it costs the United States something. It costs the United States in the extent that if you believe that you have to balance a weapon system, if the Soviet Union breaks ahead in a certain technological area based on advantages that it's stolen or otherwise obtained from your country, then you have to probably counter it. And that ends up costing money. I mean, I think that as someone who knows an awful lot about the MX missile, I can tell you that were it not for the latest generation of Soviet ICBMs, we wouldn't even need an MX missile. The MX missile, if it gets passed by Congress and deployed, is going to cost upwards to $20 or $30 billion. Well, it's an awful lot of money. A lot of experts who know the Soviet weapon systems tell you that one of the reasons they've been able to develop the SS-18, which is their equivalent of the MX, is because they have a very critical ball bearing. That critical ball bearing was the machine that makes it was purchased in the United States and illegally exported. That's something that is, in an indirect way, costing us money because we are having to balance their weapons developments with our own. And I think ultimately, if it doesn't cost us money and we don't balance, it probably costs us something even greater, which is the military balance, which I think has kept the peace over the years. But that's a bit digressing from the main point. I don't have too much to add to that, except that I will be happy to take, I'm sure, any of your questions. And to thank you, especially some of the people who didn't think I should have a chance to speak. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you. Morton Halperin, the last speaker on our panel, is an old friend of mine. He started his government career with a bang as one of the McNamara whiz kids back in July 1966 through 1969. In the Department of Defense, he was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense in the Office of the Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs. He then spent a period of time with as a senior staff member of the National Security Council. It was during that time that he was the subject of a wiretap that was instituted by Henry Kissinger upon his house, and that lasted for approximately 14 months and has been the subject of a long litigated lawsuit, Halperin versus Kissinger, which is still alive and well in the courts of the United States. Following his time with the National Security Council, Mr. Halperin spent approximately 2 years with the defense of the Ellsberg case in Los Angeles, California, which is where I became friends with him. He was an expert witness in the case and the chief consultant to the defense, and was really the architect of the defense in many ways, using his expertise on national security as well as his great familiarity with the Pentagon Papers as a resource in the case. Following that, Mort has spent a good deal of time since his major preoccupation being the director of the Center for National Security Studies in Washington. The center is an organization jointly sponsored by the American Civil Liberties Union and the Fund for Peace, and has as its central mission the examination of matters of information policy, particularly in relation to national security. Mort has written a number of books, approximately a dozen books. He is expert on bureaucratic politics, information policy, nuclear policy, arms negotiation. He has been involved through the center, which has a litigating arm, in any number of lawsuits, particularly dealing with the subject of Freedom of Information Act and with travel across our borders. It's my pleasure to introduce to you my friend and my colleague. I should have mentioned he has taught at Harvard Law School in national security and civil liberties, Mr. Morton Halperin.
It's clear that anything I say will only lead to my reputation going down, so I'm tempted to stop. Charlie did not mention that I taught at Harvard for 6 years before I went into the government, and so I hold the university responsible for any trouble I may have gotten into. I think that whoever arranged the panel went after and got the wrong culprit. The culprit is not the Defense Department. The culprit here is the White House, and I suspect that the real culprit is, in fact, the President of the United States. There are legitimate secrets, and there is a legitimate problem of espionage. There is also, in my view, a legitimate problem of the unauthorized disclosure of classified information, but that unauthorized disclosure of classified information almost always comes from senior officials at the top of the government. Often, as in the case of this administration, senior officials at the top of the government who spend most of their time fighting with each other and who are willing to leak classified information and to claim leaks of classified information as part of those intramural squabbles. What I think we do not have is a problem of the public reporting, of the press reporting what it knows. The problem that we have in that regard is in the other direction, namely the government's attempt to keep us from knowing information. Now, Mr. Reagan has made it clear to us in the last few weeks, actually, just why it is that his government has gone about the business of trying to censor access to information. Mr. Reagan doesn't think we need the information because he doesn't think that there ought to be any debate on national security matters. So it is not a question of balancing the information that we need for public debate against the need for secrecy. He simply thinks that we ought not to debate national security matters. You may have read in the report or seen his recent press conference in which Mr. Reagan was asked the lesson of Vietnam as he saw it. And he said a rather astonishing thing. He said, the lesson of Vietnam is that we should have declared war. Because if we had declared war, then the opponents of the policy in the United States could have been accused of treason and therefore made to desist in debating and criticizing the war. And Mr. Reagan has tried to do that about the opponents of his policy now. He told us a while back that anybody who supported the nuclear freeze was a witting or unwitting dupe of the international communist movement. And he said much the same thing, and recently the Secretary of State has said much the same thing about the opponents of the policy in Central America. Moreover, Mr. Reagan, in a recent speech in Washington, Georgetown University, said that the Congress had an obligation not only to support the general outlines of his policy, but also the details of his policy. And he pointed out very clearly that if they did not do that, he would simply accuse them of being responsible for all the failures of his policy, while, of course, taking credit for any successors that may happen to occur. And he made it clear that he thought that the Congress was responsible for the Lebanon debacle because it had not given total and complete support to his policy. And a high government official, then on background, and later his identity was given away by the White House press office, with the President's national security advisor, said that he thought if a senator or congressman disagreed with the President's policy, he ought to write him a secret and private letter about that disagreement rather than make the issue public. The administration has also resorted to the technique of the Bipartisan Commission as a way of seeking to silence debate. We had the Scowcroft Commission, we had the Kissinger Commission. In each case, commissions carefully selected. Every member of the Scowcroft Commission had publicly supported the MX missile before he was appointed to that commission. The Kissinger Commission had one possible opponent of the regime. There was some suggestion that he had been appointed by mistake. But in any case, it had nobody who had ever spoken out against the Central American policy of the United States. There were a number of obvious potential candidates for a genuinely bipartisan commission on Central America, people who had worked on the policy in previous administrations, people who understood the region. None of them were on the commission. And yet the President is now heard to say that it is illegitimate for people to criticize the recommendations of the Scowcroft Commission or the Kissinger Commission because they arise from bipartisan commissions, and therefore, as citizens, what we have an obligation to do is to rally around. Now, somebody had the bad taste to ask the White House press secretary how this could be squared with Mr. Reagan's rather vicious attacks on the Panama Canal Treaty, treaties which had the support of a wide bipartisan group of Republicans and Democrats when the Carter administration proposed it. And he said that the President's thinking had evolved somewhat, no doubt as a result of becoming president, which tends to change one's perspective on whether the debate is legitimate or not. Now, the government has also resorted to keep us from being able to participate in the debate in a new technique which it has developed, which I think is one of its most creative techniques. It is something called the overt covert operation. It used to be when the government engaged in covert operations, at least had the good taste to do them in secret. We now have an administration covert operation directed at Nicaragua. Nobody any longer doubts that the United States is involved in it. Indeed, the United States the other day told the World Court that it no longer had jurisdiction over what it was doing because it said Nicaragua is about to sue us for engaging in efforts to overthrow their government, and we don't want the World Court involved. One would have thought that if we were not engaged in the business of overthrowing governments, we would have simply told the World Court that we were not involved in this process. Nevertheless, although this is an overt covert operation, the government still refuses to explain what it's about or what its purpose is. And indeed, we had the spectacle during the Senate debate of the President sort of hinting at a press conference that indeed it was a covert operation, that indeed we were behind it, and that its purpose was to overthrow the government of Nicaragua and to install a democratic government. Whereupon Mr. Moynihan, the Vice Chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, rose on the Senate floor to say that the President had misspoken about his policy, that the President had got it wrong, and that the purpose of the covert operation was actually something quite different. Whereupon Mr. Reagan wrote a letter to Senator Baker saying that Mr. Moynihan did have it right, and whatever he said, the policy was, if we were doing this covert operation, that that was the purpose of it. But we nevertheless still have this spectacle that there have been no hearings in public on this operation. The administration refuses to identify Mr. Schultz. When asked about it, said that he couldn't discuss the covert operation because it was secret. When Mr. Weinberger was asked on television last Sunday whether the United States had mined the harbors of Nicaragua, he said no, because Mr. Weinberger, like Ms. Troyer, speaks only for the Defense Department. He was then asked, what about the CIA? And he said, oh, I don't speak for the CIA, and I can't tell you whether the CIA is mining the harbors or not. There now seems no doubt that they are mining the harbors. The government is also, in addition to trying to make debate illegitimate and to tell us that it's not appropriate to discuss these subjects, is trying to keep from us the information necessary to have that debate. And you have already heard about the now infamous PD 84, about attempts to limit the Freedom of Information Act. But the government is also engaged in a new process, or at least an acceleration of an old process. Namely, it's trying to create an ideological or information fortress around the United States. It is seeking to deprive American citizens of information from foreigners about what is going on in foreign countries that is relevant to the policy of the United States. It has, for example, begun to deny visas to people because it says it does not want to give a propaganda platform to those who oppose American policy. And no doubt you've read about denials of visa to Thomas Borge, the Interior Minister in Nicaragua, to Mr. Ungo, the head of the opposition political movement and guerrilla forces in El Salvador, to several Cuban women. Perhaps the most outrageous case of all concerns an Italian general, a man named Nino Pesti, who I should say the government says is a member of the World Peace Council. He denies it. Whatever that may be, he was planning to come to the United States for one purpose and one purpose only, to give a speech on the Boston Common at a demonstration against the deployment of American cruise missiles and Pershing missiles in Europe. He had been in the United States many times. Indeed, he had been stationed in the Pentagon for several years. The government denied him a visa. The State Department explained that this was not an opportune time for him to come to the United States to engage in the activity that he intended to engage in. In other words, that it was not appropriate for Americans trying to make up their mind about this issue to hear the views of an Italian general during a demonstration on the Export Control Act. Now, I think when you look at the question of the right of the government to keep information secret, it is not possible to enunciate any absolute principle. There is some information that the government can keep secret, has a right to keep secret. There is other information that it should not. But I think if you look at this attempt to create an ideological fortress around the United States, that it is possible, and indeed urgent and necessary, to establish a basic fundamental principle. And that principle, I think, should be that the government of the United States should not impose any restrictions on the ability of American citizens to gather information abroad. We should not be afraid of free trade in ideas. We should welcome it. And we should allow American citizens to travel abroad without restriction, to subscribe to books and periodicals and newspapers and magazines. We should allow our scientists to speak on unclassified subjects with foreign scientists. And we should let anybody come into this country to speak who American citizens want to hear. I think that the government has a substantial advantage over the rest of us in that it controls the information that the U.S. government produces, and it is very hard to equalize that fight. But I think at the very least, the First Amendment requires that the government not interfere in any way with our ability to gather information from abroad, information increasingly vital to public debate on major national security issues. Thank you.
All right, now, our method of proceeding from here is as follows. We've set aside a brief period of time in which each of us here on the panel will have a shot at asking anyone else on the panel a question. I expect that that should take no more than 10 minutes. And we would like to devote the rest of our time to participation with the audience, back and forth with audience questions. I'd like to presume by starting the questioning and do it in the following way, addressing a question, if I may, to Cicely Bach. In a sense, as devil's advocate, but I must say not entirely so, and perhaps stimulated a bit by Ms. Troya's introduction. Here we sit as a panel of people, Mort having spoken about ideological barriers, when it certainly seems that there is no tremendous risk that we will be insulated from world opinion given our free press. Mr. Bamford writes a book which is so good that it becomes a national bestseller on the National Security Agency, an amazing phenomenon which has got to be taken as a tribute to the freedom of information in the country. I admit to having had a marvelous time bringing lawsuits under the Freedom of Information Act, in which, to my frankly utter astonishment, I succeed in demanding from the CIA and the FBI records of various persons and activities which I can choose for myself, and getting not only response but getting paid attorney's fees for the trouble of litigating the suits. Isn't it possible to say that we're a little bit benighted in our liberalism up here, and that in fact what we are complaining about is something that could well be looked at from the other direction as extraordinary freedom?
Well, I'm glad to answer that, because I would agree with you that the United States has had extraordinary freedom with respect to gathering information, with respect to travel, and many other things. Nevertheless, as I see it, this freedom is under threat now, and it doesn't take very much, unfortunately, before great dangers arise. If it had been possible, for instance, for the Nixon government to stop information about Watergate to leak out, we would all have been the losers. And there are a great many kinds of information about the war in Vietnam, including the Pentagon Papers, that we are very grateful to have now belatedly and to have had a little earlier belatedly. But it is a fact that a very powerful government that succeeds in keeping matters secret that the public has a right to know is a tremendous threat. And the trouble is that it is never possible, I think, for a government to be such an ideal government that if it has the control over information, that it will only use it when it is absolutely legitimate to do so. I would use, for instance, the invasion of Grenada as an example of something that I think you yourself would have liked to know about and debate in advance.
Having answered that one, may I call upon you to ask a question of your own?
Yes, if I may ask a question of Mort Halperin. I was very interested in this concept of overt, covert operation, and I think obviously there's something like that going on, but what changes that? What changes does that bring in, do you feel, into the public debate? Is it better that a covert operation is now a little more overt so that we can debate it? Or is there a problem because, since it's still a little bit covert, we can't find out everything we'd like to know about it?
Well, I think that it's better than having a covert operation, and I think we have a number of those going on now as well. But the problem is that people then say, well, so what if they call it a covert operation? We now know about it. We now can debate it. The problem is that the government asserts the legitimacy of not publicly answering any questions about it because it asserts that it's secret. So Ronald Reagan is asked about it, and he makes a general statement, and then he refuses to say anymore. The Secretary of State continues to refuse to publicly say, what is our policy against Nicaragua? Are we trying to overthrow the government? Are we trying simply to blockade? And what they hide behind is the statement that this is a covert operation, and obviously we can't be forced to defend it. In fact, what it is a war. It is an undeclared war, and it has now been accompanied by an illegal blockade. And we have announced to the world it is illegal by this race to the courtroom door, where we ran in first to say, you can't decide this issue because it would be a diversion for you to decide it against us. If the government had to defend this publicly, it would not do it. It would not engage in an illegal act, a clear violation of international law, a clear act of belligerency, if it had to defend it. It is because it can treat it as a covert operation that it is able to do it. So while I welcome overt covert as compared to covert covert, it has its pitfalls and its dangers.
More to question from you?
I think I'll pass.
Ms. Troya, he passes to you.
Yes, I'm not going to, again, talk about the entire administration, but I think a subject did come up which I'm happy to talk about, and that's Grenada and press access. And let me take the premise that Mrs. Bach made, which she would have been delighted to have the opportunity to debate Grenada openly. Is the mic on?
Yes.
Yes. Debate Grenada openly before we did it. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Grenada, but let me just paint the picture of what the island looked like. It's roughly a pear shape that looks like this. On the top part of the island, there was a campus of students. If you could picture, probably Harvard Square would be a very good way of envisioning it, because it was a campus that had buildings on the inside, and it was more or less surrounded. There was also a campus down at this end of the pear. The intelligence of what had happened in Grenada before we went in was extremely spotty. There were the operation was planned within about 48 hours when the first signals came that there was a 24-hour shoot to kill curfew. In other words, if you were in Harvard Square and you wanted to go to the coop, you wouldn't be. When the reports first came out of that, and there was the realization that there were potentially close to 600 or 700 students that could be taken hostage, the operation was planned very quickly. It was about 48 hours' notice. The president didn't make the decision to do it until about 24 hours before it happened. And about 24 hours before, there were some, as I understand it, a few people who spoke Spanish who were dropped onto the island to try to figure out where were the students, were they being held hostage. We didn't think so, but we weren't sure. Were any of them killed? Had any of them been killed in the shoot to kill curfew? Remember, there was no radio transmission out. There were a few ham operators, but not anywhere near where the two students were in these two parts of the island. Now, knowing full well that there were anywhere, the estimates were anywhere from about 400 to a couple of thousand Cuban troops. No idea if these were guys who were just construction workers or the actual soldiers. Very little sense of what the Grenadian government, there was really no Grenadian government, there was a sort of a military junta, and they didn't have any services that you and I would think of as a junta. They basically roamed the streets shooting people. What was the condition? Now, I would hesitate to say that if we tried to debate the Grenada operation for maybe a couple of weeks and waited for a congressional resolution, I don't want to make a hypothetical out of something that wasn't, but I think it would have been very unlikely that there would have been 600 students that were taken out of Grenada alive.
But how about coverage as it was going on?
That's a very good question. Again, because of the uncertainty, and in a military sense, it's very difficult to take an island, and it's almost impossible to take a campus on an island. No, if you thought the Iranian rescue mission was a difficult maneuver to pull off, hostage situations in the two campuses on Grenada would have been almost impossible. The feeling was very much that even 2 or 3 hours notice tip-off, if the operation had leaked even 2 or 3 hours in advance, that was enough time for those campuses to be surrounded and the students to be taken in some kind of a hostage situation. So the decision was made, and one can debate whether it was a wise decision. At the time, the decision was made primarily for concern of those 600 students' lives and the uncertain conditions that they were faced with, that it was not a good idea to take press along. There was also the question of what kind of conditions the troops would have landed in. They didn't know the weather conditions, for example. I mean, the Army troops had to parachute in because the weather conditions were such that they couldn't land their landing boats on the island. It would have been very difficult. to take press, certainly on the first wave. I don't know if any of them are trained paratroopers on the Pentagon Press Corps. I kind of, having looked at most of them and worked with most of them, I rather doubt it. However, I think it would have been very difficult to take them in on the first wave. If people had been informed of it in advance, say in a press pool had been taken onto the ships, there was always the very major question of would it have leaked. I don't know, but I hate to put 600 lives in the balance and hoping that it didn't leak. And I think the better question is what happened once we got into Grenada. There was a hostile fire. Nobody really expected that to happen. The Cubans put up a fight. They turned out not to be guys with construction workers. They turned out to be regular military. They fought, and they fought very hard. They did not take the student areas hostage basically because they weren't in position to do so when we landed. The fighting continued for the first day, and there was a question of should we bring the press in at the end of the first day. Well, the students weren't out by the end of the first day. Although there were not troops surrounding the perimeter of Harvard Square, there were troops between where our troops were and the students were. By the second day, we started getting the first campus. Remember, again, there are two campuses. We started getting the first campus out. And again, it was decided at the end of midday the second day, that we would not let press into the area until we were sure we got all the 600 students out.
What were you afraid was going to leak then?
Well, I don't think anybody was too afraid of anything leaking at that point. I think that was much more of a concern that you really just wanted to get those kids out of there.
And what did that have to do with keeping the press out?
That's a very fair question. But I think you have to remember that if they're... Now, the press would tell you, well, they'd be just delighted to get shot at and nobody'd have to protect them. But I think that there was a very real question of what were your priorities, and the priorities were to get the students out. And immediately at the end of the second day, when all the students were taken out, and Sir Paul Schoon, who had been the consul general, who had been, as it later turned out, imprisoned, once they got out, the press was in. And I believe by the end of the third day, and Dave Gergen can probably correct me, there were several hundred press, and there was, I think for every soldier we had sent in, every 5 soldiers that we had sent in, there was one member of the press. It was rather well populated. There was no attempt to censor, as I think other people have said, any of their work. There was no attempt to censor film footage, for example, or still photographs. And there's a big debate going on right now in the Department of Defense, and did we do it wrong? Should we have brought press along? Should we have perhaps had a pool of press on that ship? Should we have brought them in on the first day? I think very few people disagree that we should have announced and debated Grenada in the halls of Congress before we got 600 students out. But there's a very good and serious debate going on now, which I'd like to see continue, and it's not resolved.
Thank you very much. Say, Mr. Bamford, with your permission, since we're running a little behind, I would like to get to audience questions just as soon as possible. And let me begin. Yes.
Mr. Bamford,
Yes.
in your book, you mentioned the ability of
Would you like to step forward and state your question to the mic, or the mic on the side right there? And could you identify yourself for the audience?
Sure. Len Bierbrand, Harvard Business School. Mr. Bamford, in your book you mentioned the ability of the NSA to listen in on private citizens through the use of microwave, towards the end of your book, if I recall, without the physical planting of bugs. What I'd like to hear you speak about is how extensive you think this use actually is, and for what purposes, and whether or not you would hypothesize that other than the NSA is using that kind of ability to listen in on private citizens.
Yes. Without using bugs to intercept telephone conversations, it's the way the NSA does it is by intercepting microwave signals. Most people don't realize it today, but the telephone wire only carries the telephone conversation a very short distance. After that, for a long-distance telephone call, it goes by microwave, which is basically a radio signal. It has to be between 2 points, 2 direct points. What the NSA does, and what is its major responsibility, is intercepting these microwave channels, these communications links. One of the major areas that they do this interception is on international communications. It's communications from to and from the United States. 2 points in the United States where they do it specifically is a little area in West Virginia called Sugar Grove. Sugar Grove is a large NSA base with huge satellite dish type antennas. And only about 60 miles away is the major satellite receiving base for the eastern coast of the United States. It's a ComSat station, commercial satellite station. So if you're calling, if somebody is calling you from London, the odds are it would go up to an Intelsat satellite over the Atlantic and then down to Edam, West Virginia. Well, at the same time, that signal doesn't just go to Edam. Its footprint, what they call a footprint, covers at least the entire United States. And it could be very easily picked up by NSA in this, what they call a radio quiet zone in Sugar Grove, where their listening post is. Also, incidentally, it could be picked up very easily in Cuba by Soviet facilities, the same nature. But that's basically the type of eavesdropping that NSA does, and it's far beyond the normal concept of bugging an individual telephone. It's bugging entire circuits, entire streams of communications, and that communications intercepted by NSA is then processed through computers, which are programmed for either telephone numbers, or if it's a digital communication like a telex or a telegram, it could be programmed for individual names, individual words.
All right, follow up. The point I was trying to get at is between private citizens in this country. If I were to call you, for example, do you have any knowledge that there is through the use of this technology that conversation could be, and in fact may be listened into?
Well, actually, NSA's policy had always been, right from its very beginning, not to get involved in entirely domestic conversations where both points are in the United States. As far as I know, they kept to that policy fairly strictly. However, in 1978, there was a new act passed called the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, the FISA Act. And under that act, the NSA was given permission for the first time to intercept entirely domestic communications. And so NSA does have the legal authority to do that now. There are certain restrictions. They have to show this very secret court, brand new secret court called the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. They have to show this court that there's some foreign connection with the person. The person's a foreign agent or working for a foreign power of some sort. However, the problem is that the court has never ever turned down a case. It has never ever turned the government down on any of these cases since 1978 that NSA has brought before it. And also, the other point is that if NSA is given this authority to do domestic eavesdropping, it's only logical to assume that NSA is going to develop and devote some resources into putting structures in place to do actual construction to permit itself to eavesdrop on these domestic links. What extent they have done that, I have no idea, but the court does approve, I think it's about an average of about 500 requests by NSA a year to do this domestic national security eavesdropping. Well, I'm not an expert on wiretapping law, but there's...
he is mistaken. It's against the law everywhere.
But there's a
federal law against listening to you. I don't recommend you go out and listen to your neighbor's phone calls. You are physically able to. There is a federal law which makes it illegal. But that's where one of the parties to the conversation consents to the wiretapping. But if you call your neighbor, you can listen into your conversation with him. But if he's calling somebody else, it is against the law.
You get into a gray area to some extent when you do it with telex type of communication. I don't think there's a specific law against intercepting telex in digital communication. And also there's a theory where if you buy a satellite dish, for example, and put it in your backyard, and you tune it to, I don't know, 6 gigahertz or 8 gigahertz, whatever the downlink is on a telephone satellite, and you just listen to it, but you don't divulge it, well, that might be a gray area, because the theory is if a signal falls in my backyard, I ought to be able to go out and pick it up.
Let's have a question from this microphone.
Yes, hello, my name is Tom Martin, and Ms. Troy, you stated that the previous speakers inaccurately described President Reagan's pre-publication Censure Act 84, but that you did not want to go into it. Well, why don't you keep us out of the dark and go into it?
Okay, I don't, again, I want to preface this by saying I am not a lawyer, nor have I studied these issues with great familiarity. As I understand the Directive 84, which, again, is not being instituted, and I think Mort probably knows this better than I do if you want to correct me. As I understand it, there are two controversial sections. That the ruling, the directive in its entirety, had a number of elements. Some of the elements were basically to clean up the various differences with the way components of the Department of Defense conduct handling classified information, and the Justice Department might do so differently. The elements of it were to basically make a uniform way of dealing with this information. The two controversial aspects of it, which have since been abandoned by the administration, one of them was the pre-publication clearance. That would not have included all people who ever had security clearances. It would have been, again, the people who were subject to have access to these compartmental security clearances. What I said. I thought you were saying anybody who had access to highly secret information, and that's technically not the term. Secondly, that they would have to submit documents that were on any aspect of sort of classified information, not just that compartmented information. The polygraphs I'm not as sure of, but again, I believe it only applied to that small percentage of people who would have been compartmented. And Mort, you can probably correct me.
I think the polygraph test did apply to anybody who was being fired, and there was a right to the polygraph. But I'm not really certain about the polygraph.
Sisla?
I think you're definitely correct about that. Absolutely, yes.
Question from this microphone.
Yes, I'd like to address my question to Mrs. Bach. In your remarks, you seem to imply that you feel that no ideal sort of government could use its power of secrecy only when that power is absolutely necessary. Would you agree that there are certain situations in which that power can be legitimately used? And if so, how do you create a body of laws that will minimize the times that it will not use its power of secrecy illegitimately?
I think that's a very good question, and that really focuses on the conflict in this whole situation. It is obviously necessary for a government, if for no other reason than self-defense. There are other reasons as well, and I won't go into them now, but if we only take self-defense for the moment, secrecy is obviously an important aspect of self-defense. And yet, because no government is ideal, no government consists of people who are entirely devoid of personal desires for self-advancement or even for just staying in office, because of those factors, it is the case that governments tend to use secrecy and the power of secrecy to cover up a great many other things. There have been many, many studies, mostly done indeed by the Defense Department and by other agencies in the government. All of them have shown that much too much is classified, much too much is kept secret. It's even counterproductive for the government itself, not only for the nation. So that there is this enormous problem then. How do we then have regulations and rules and laws that can protect us and can protect the government in diplomacy and in military affairs as it needs to be protected, and at the same time not expose the nation itself to danger, not expose citizens to danger, and not provide the counterproductive measures that secrecy so often bring along. And I guess I would say that in the first place, we constantly have to be on the guard against every expansion of secrecy. Secrecy tends to expand almost by its own, because officials are always willing to cover up a few more aspects of what they're doing, so that we have to have the burden of proof against every new form of secrecy. And we also have to inquire about every existing form of secrecy. There should be sunset laws for forms of secrecy that are no longer necessary. And I think it is possible, but it does take enormous attention on the part of the citizenry and of their elected officials. I don't think that it can be done just by one branch of the government, the courts, for instance, or the administration. That's why it's so important, again, that we have the opportunity to debate these matters and to bring up sometimes even very small and specific points that we'd like to see changed.
Question.
I'd like to direct this question to Ms. Troya and anyone else who wants to answer it. Edward Teller, not exactly known as one of the nation's leading liberals, has made the following suggestion. Allow the government to classify anything it wants to for a period of time of, say, 6 months or a year, and then after that date, make everything declassified. I believe part of his reasoning was that by that point, anyone who really wants to know it, such as the Russians, will already know it. Could you comment on this suggestion of Dr. Teller's?
Well, it reminds me of the suggestion of Admiral Rickover, who once said that there were too many people who worked in the Department of Defense, and his idea of getting rid of them was on day one, on Monday, you would close all the doors to the rooms on the 4th floor. And so anybody who was really good would have found a place on one of the other 3 floors by day 2. And on day 2, you would close all the doors in floor 3. And so by Wednesday, anybody who still had an office was probably actually pretty good. And so you'd probably work it down so that by day 5, you'd have all the people who were really good. And it sounds very similar to what Mr. Teller's suggesting. I don't know. I mean, I think that there always is a danger of overclassifying or keeping things classified for too long. But I think that there are probably some things that have to do with, particularly with weapon systems, or with protecting the identity of foreign agents, for example, where if you took, say there was something that was classified secret, and it was the name of Mr. Haddam, for example, who had been helping you find out about terrorism out of the Middle East, and Mr. Haddam was alive and well and living in Syria, for example, and he was a continuing source of information on terrorism. If in 6 months you publish Mr. Haddam's name, I would think Mr. Haddam does not live but 6 months and 1 day. I can see that that's a situation where Mr. Teller's idea may not make much sense.
As a follow-up, you mentioned the weapons systems, and I think Dr. Teller, between his work on the Manhattan Project, the hydrogen bomb,
yes, I'm familiar with who he
and
is.
space-based ballistic missile systems, would have had enough experience working with weapon systems to know whether or not the Russians know this information after 6 months or a year. What about specifically on a weapon system, and forget about the foreign agent? Yeah.
Well,
I think we've
All right.
had
Could
it on
I
this
answer
one,
that
so
with one
let's
sentence?
try another one. If I may, let me just
Oh,
continue,
surely,
because we've got a lot of people to...
My name is
Go
Pamela
ahead.
Gerloff. I have a question, and I'd like an answer from both Cicely Bach and James Bamford. And this has to do with the question of personal ethics. What I'm wondering is how you consider that issue with regard to revealing information. I presume, Mr. Bamford, that NSA thought that you were publishing information that was damaging to national security, and I'd like to know if they tried to present a case to you to support that viewpoint, and if indeed they had been able to present a case that convinced you that this was damaging to national security, even though the documents you used were unclassified at the time you used them, would you have refrained from publishing the information? And if you would both also speak to this issue in terms of how this might be considered in relation to the individual citizens, the question of the individual citizen's right to, in fact, determine certain policy. An example of this would be in the Carter administration, the rescue attempt for the hostages in Iran. If the press had known about this ahead of time, as some say they may have, and the government presented a case to them to try to keep it secret, yet those journalists felt that the attempt should not be attempted. What are the ethical considerations there, and how do you approach it?
Well, I think that's a very important question, the ethical considerations. In doing my book, just to talk on that one specific incident of the NSA trying to reclassify that document, that was the reason for my second meeting with them, was because I wanted to give them an opportunity to tell me what it was they were worried about, and they refused. They just said, there's material in there we don't want to have released.
Did they say that's secret?
They said that what it is that we want to delete is secret. Telling you what it is would be giving it away to you or something like that. But anyway, I asked them again, and they refused. There were a number of times in doing my book that people told me things that I didn't put in the book because I did think that the information might compromise national security. In doing the book, I specifically didn't ask questions. I didn't ask questions such as how good are we at breaking the Soviet crypto systems, and which circuits are we monitoring in the Soviet Union. My theory of putting the book together was to give a background on an agency very few people had ever heard of that controls an enormous portion of the budget that's 5 times the size of the CIA. But it wasn't to expose as much as I could possibly expose. I concentrated on the operational side, on the domestic area of NSA's involvement, and I tried to stay away from the actual techniques of breaking codes, which I couldn't figure out if I had a lifetime to work on it. So anyway, I did use self-restraint on that area. In terms of the second part of the question, where if people in the media were given information on a Iranian hostage rescue, was that
right?
Yeah, I couldn't imagine why anybody would jump the gun and release that information, and I think it would be, if I was the editor, it would be his last day on the paper if he did, I guess.
Except that there are those in the journalism business who regret that they held the information about the Bay of Pigs.
That's right. And matter of fact, President Kennedy was the one who came out and said, I wish, he said it to Ben Bradley or some journalist, I wish you had gone ahead and published what you knew about it before I went ahead and made this enormous blunder. So that there is two ways of looking at it. I think you have to take each individual situation carefully. I think when you have lives in jeopardy, I think maybe the best bet ought to be to err on the side of safety. It's a hard question to answer. The other question, the first part of the question, was easier, I think, where you had information and it was a question of whether or not to release some esoteric piece of information, not a life-endangering piece of information.
All right, I'm going to take 2 more questions and then bring this to a close.
All right, my name is Ira Baskow. I think that everyone seems to agree that a lot of things are classified long after they need to be classified. I was working on a project about the early years of atomic energy, and I found all sorts of things classified that could have no possible military usefulness. Films of the waste at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, perhaps a lot of propaganda value, but not really a military secret. So what I wanted to ask, and it might be for you, Professor Neston, the moderator, is what kind of routine declassification exists? As a thesis writer, I did a lot of my research at the last minute, did not have time to go through the Freedom of Information Act. But also, particularly, I was wondering about the declassification of titles. It seems like very often it's hard to even find out that the information exists. So maybe, and I suppose that Mr. Bamford might have a lot to say about that too.
Well, I suspect I'm not by any means the most expert. My understanding with declassification is that the old structure had time periods in it after which there had to be a assessment if you wanted to continue classification with different time periods for different levels of classification. But
was that
I may be dated.
Well, there was in the Carter Executive Order a requirement for automatic declassification, except for information which was exempt from automatic declassification. And a study was done which revealed that almost everything was exempt from automatic declassification. And in fact, it went back. It was existed in the Johnson administration and before. The Reagan order has abolished automatic declassification, which is in principle a step backwards. In practice, it makes very little difference since almost everything was stamped with a stamp which exempted it from automatic declassification. I think the real method that has to be used is the Freedom of Information Act, and I think that the Act has been in effect in its new form for 7 years now, and the people have an obligation to find out how to use it and make their requests and to identify those documents. You don't have to give the government the names of the documents. You can ask for an area of information. And they then have to do a declassification review. I think that's much more efficient than having the government randomly review documents for declassification, in which case they'll pick documents that nobody's in the slightest bit interested in.
Question.
Mr. Bamford, about 5 or 6 years ago in Scientific American, I read an article about the study of brainwave patterns and that it might be possible someday to actually read people's minds. I haven't read anything about that since. I was wondering if that day had yet arrived.
He didn't identify himself, but he's worried.
I don't know of any technologies that NSA has that can do that. I mean, they have some pretty advanced technologies, but I wouldn't be surprised if they're working on it. I don't really anticipate that they've come up with a technology yet, but if they did, that would be within NSA's domain, I think. Yes, I've heard of that.
Say that last question was so good. Do you think we can continue with just 2 more? We've only got 2 more up here.
Great.
Go ahead.
Hi, my name is John DeVivier, and I'm a visitor from Indiana. And I'd like to ask Ms. Troya what sorts of conflicts, if any, she sees between the goal of preserving democracy and resorting to essentially anti-democratic means to do so.
Do you assume that classification is anti-democratic?
That's it. I would suggest that anything that relies upon secrecy and prevention of public debate is, in principle, anti-democratic, and it has to be justified.
I got a feeling that this is going to be a long answer.
I think that's, I'd be happy to talk to you about it for about 2 minutes afterwards, but I think that I would probably disagree with your basic premise that there's something undemocratic and evil about secrecy. I think that it's not a particularly good world we live in, and it's one we don't make. And I would be delighted if it was a world where we didn't need to have secrets. But I think that Mr. Haddam, the fellow I might have mentioned earlier, who might be helping us find out about terrorist acts or other forms of weapons security, I think are very essential. And I guess I just disagree with your premise that something that is evil, if it's classified secret.
Can I remand you to your 2 minutes afterwards with him?
Yeah.
Last question.
Yeah, I'm Dave Gergen. I'm a visitor from Washington. I wondered, since Mr. Reagan, I guess, has been put somewhat in the dock, and I guess I'm a partner in crime, if I might be permitted a moment or two to talk.
Go for it.
Just ask a question. I happen to believe that what Mr. Halperin proposed at the end of his remarks about the government of the United States should not impose any restrictions to gather information abroad, to subscribe to books and periodicals, and the right to free information flow. I think there's a great deal of merit to those proposals, and I think they deserve a lot of serious consideration both by those within and without government. I think I'm on record as being very firmly opposed to NSD 84 and the more controversial sections of that, and to also being on record as saying that a lot of aspects of the press coverage of Grenada were a mistake by the administration. However, frankly, I was a little surprised and disappointed that in a university like this, some of the statements that were being made at the podium tonight seemed to me to show somewhat a callous disregard for the facts. We were told that there was unprecedented tension between the East and West today, and I think that would be a surprise to most people who went through the Berlin airlift and to the Cuban Missile Crisis. We were told it was a view of this administration that it was illegitimate to criticize national bipartisan commissions, and I don't think anybody in this administration has said anything of the sort. We were told that the President of the United States wants to silence national debate about foreign policy, and I think it's quite clear that we have a flourishing national debate right now on foreign policy, and the President has never taken that view. We were told that the President of the United States has said that those who are in the peace movement are dupes of the Communist Party, and I think it's quite clear the President did not say that. He did say that there were those who in the peace movement who were under the influence, and perhaps were unwittingly so. He also said that the vast majority of people in the peace movement were sincere and arrived at their convictions without regard to the Communist Party or their agents or anything like that. Yeah, I think you go back and look at the record, I think you will find that to be the case from time to time. But I think the thing that's pertinent to this group in this session is the assertion that we see a secrecy offensive basically without parallel in this country today. And that is what I think I take the sharpest issue with. There was an article in the Washington Post, I think it was in November of last year, that was very critical of government and said that in a single year the administration had polygraphed 20,000 employees. That in a single year that same government had required that those in the reporters who went to the State Department or the Defense Department had to be accompanied by a third party before they could interview anybody. That in that same year the Defense Department told its employees they had a right to distort the facts in order to protect national security. In that same year the head of the CIA said what we needed in this country was an Official Secrecy Act, Official Secrets Act, very similar to what they have in Great Britain. In that same year the government pronounced that it did have a right to lie. Now, that was not the administration of Ronald Reagan. That was the administration of John F. Kennedy. And what we've seen since then, we saw in another administration systematic lying on a widespread basis about the war. We saw in Mr. Halperin's own personal example of administration that wiretapped journalists, that wiretapped those within the government. And my question to the panel is, would you acknowledge that, in fact, the kind of things that are being asserted here, kind of abuses of secrecy, and we all agree that there have been abuses of secrecy, but that they have existed in the past administrations going back through the whole post-war period, that in fact there have been excesses in some other administrations which have exceeded those which we've seen in this administration. And then I'd like to ask Mr. Bamford and particularly Mr. Halperin to address themselves what I thought was the best question of the night, the one directed to Mrs. Bach, and that is how does one try to resolve these kind of tensions, and how can we constructively come to an arrangement or some standards in the country which really do clear this up and I think do protect our civil liberties while also protecting our legitimate interests in national security. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gergen. I have a feeling we should have had that question asked at the beginning and we would have had more opportunity for answer, but let's take a crack at it anyway. Mr. Halperin?
Well, I think maybe we should send our visitor from Washington back to Washington, since I think most of what he said about the Reagan administration was true until he left the White House. I would submit that my characterization of Mr. Reagan's most recent speeches is not a distortion, but the speeches are there and we can all look at them and see what they have to say. I think it is true that every administration in the post-war period, and indeed even during the war, has been guilty of excesses of secrecy. I've given up trying to decide which one is worse. I think this administration in some ways has gone to try to do things like PD 84, which were excessive, although it is the process of beginning to try to censor former officials, of course, started in previous administrations. One area in which I think the Reagan administration has been better, and I want to put that on the record, is in the view that weak investigations ought to focus on government officials and not on the press. That was not, of course, the view of the Nixon administration or of the Carter administration. But nobody who reads Jimmy Carter's memoirs can think that the notion that debate is not legitimate on national security matters started with Ronald Reagan. Indeed, I would urge you, if you have such thoughts, to read the book. The question of how to balance, I think, as I try to suggest, is very different in the foreign area, where I think it is possible to have the absolute principle that I suggested.
Domestically, I think that there is no magic formula. I would leave the Freedom of Information Act about where it is. I would like to see the courts more actively involved in enforcing it than they have been. I would like to see the executive order on classification to go back to where it was in the Carter administration, in particular to reimpose the requirement of the government to take account of the public's right to know and need for the information, as well as the possible harm to national security in deciding what information to make public, because I think it is very often the case that the release of information would cause some harm. The question, in my view, the right question in a democratic society, is whether that harm is outweighed by the importance of the information to public debate on national security matters. And I think government officials who classify, and especially who consider declassification, ought to be required to take account of that balance. And I would like to see us get a consensus that leaks can't be stopped, and that the real problem is the irresponsibility of senior officials. I don't know what you do about that, and espionage. And I think that we could, in fact, improve the espionage laws if the government stopped trying to use them against the press and was willing to confine them to real espionage.
Mr. Bamford?
I just have a few comments on it. In doing research for my book, I have seen examples of over-secrecy on many administrations, not just the Reagan administration. One problem, I think, is that the tendency is to classify so much information, and when you try to classify so much information, it sort of makes a joke out of secrecy when some examples of the overclassification come out. You have levels of secrecy that just extend tremendously. The Carter administration, as a matter of fact, tried to come out with a brand new level called royal secret. So there's been these attempts all along. Back in the Truman administration, for example, even the existence of NSA was considered classified information. The existence of this entire agency was classified, the very name of it. So I think you can go all the way back in the administrations. It seems to come in waves. One problem I've seen is the level of overclassification. Some of the material that they're pulling out of the library down in the Marshall Library down in Virginia were letters dealing with William F. Friedman. They were letters from Friedman that one of them dealt with. It was a letter to a friend in England where he's asking this friend to pick him up a pair of long johns at a department store. That was one of the letters that was pulled out because it showed that Friedman knew this person in England. There were other examples of that, and I think once you have examples, these ridiculous examples come out, it depreciates the whole value of secrecy, so that when somebody says this is secret, they think, oh, it must be another pair of long johns or something, when it really might be a serious secret at that point. I think that's, if they can get away from making a joke themselves out of secrecy, I think they give secrecy a better name.
Mrs. Bach, do you have a final word?
Well, I think I've agreed with much that has been said here. I would just like to make one correction. I did say, and I still stand by the idea that there is an unprecedented move towards secrecy in a great many different areas. It has never been done in this concerted way before. I don't believe that I said that the tensions right now are unprecedented. Obviously, there have been international tensions that have led to world war. I do think that in the last few years the tensions are much greater, and I think most people would acknowledge that right now. They're much greater than they were 4 or 5 years ago between East and West.
Ms. Troya, you've come the furthest distance. Do you want the right to benediction here?
No, I think I'll leave that to you as the 5th member of the panel.
Well, mine is simply to thank all of you and thank members of the panel. I appreciate your presence, and I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you.